Remember postmodernism?
Postmodernism.
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 A little under a decade ago, the word postmodernism was everywhere.
To the slightly nerdier camp of the then insurgent populist right, it was a kind of disease which had infected our politics and culture. A social malaise which risked eating at the very foundations of everything which makes so-called Western societies great.
To slightly nerdy leftists and liberals, that very same word was a smug way of explaining the sheer bizarreness of that first Trump presidency.
The key to understanding a world in which a politician who lived in a gold-daubed palace was able to pose as a man of the people, and which was rapidly being introduced to a new vocabulary of fake news and alternative facts.
You're saying it's a falsehood, and they're giving Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that.
Then, at some point, postmodernism kind of just vanished from the popular consciousness. Take a look at this graph.
This line graph charts use of the adjective postmodern across Google Books' corpus of books and publications from 1980 to 2022. What we see is that, while use of the word had largely plateaued, if not begun to dip during the early 2000s, it spiked significantly in the lead up to the electoral upsets of the Trump campaign in the US and the Brexit referendum in the UK. Then, more than just regressing to the mean, its use absolutely fell off a cliff.
Of course, on the political right, some of this is simply the result of new terms coming into vogue to describe the beliefs of political enemies.
Just as panic about postmodernism was an evolution of anxieties about political correctness and cultural Marxism, so too was postmodernism deposed as word of the week by critical race theory, gender ideology, and wokeness. But the fact that critics on the left have also stopped using the word points to something much larger.
Postmodernism, I regret to inform you, is dead.
At some point over the last decade, something shifted. Not only in the way we do and speak about politics, but in the culture we consume, and the way we relate to one another as human beings. The skepticism, irony, and disbelief which, as we'll see, defined postmodernism has seemed to fade in favour of something somewhat more honest, authentic, and sincere.
It's a cultural mode which, in its tension between ridiculousness and sincerity, is perhaps best exemplified by this.
Thank you. My heart goes out to you.
Today's video then is two things.
In part, it's a post-mortem on what postmodernism was. Why was it that folks like Jordan Peterson, James Lindsay, Ben Shapiro and the rest were so incensed by it? And why, despite their criticisms, their own politics and rhetoric was shaped by it as much as anyone on the left.
But if postmodernism really is dead, then we need to find out who killed it. And what defines the postmodern era we find ourselves living in now. Suspect number one. Jordan Peterson with facts and logic in the marketplace of ideas. Let me show you a video.
You need to understand postmodernism because that's what you're up against, and you're up against it far more than you know or think. And it's a much more well-developed and pervasive, pernicious, nihilistic, intellectually attractive doctrine than has yet come to public realization.
This is the opening to a speech given by Jordan Peterson to a Canadian Conservative political conference in February 2017. Speaking just 6 months after a video of him arguing with a student on his campus in Toronto had propelled him to international fame, Peterson was there to contribute to a panel titled Censorship on Campus, taking the lead on freedom of expression.
In the end, Peterson didn't really talk about censorship at all. Not in the conventional sense.
While he momentarily alludes to students protesting against conservative speakers at universities, the vast majority of his 12 minutes is taken up by a diatribe against this thing that he calls postmodernism. And when I say diatribe, I mean it.
Fortunately, the postmodern philosophers, most of them are dead, so that's a good thing. You don't apologize to these people. That's a big mistake. Apology, they read apology as an admission of guilt. You don't apologize and you don't back down.
Amid all this rage, Peterson is less worried that conservatives are being actively blacklisted or censored in universities than that this thing called postmodernism is crowding their ideas out.
And if you want to understand what this dangerous influence is and what its goals are, he suggests you go out and buy this book.
It's called Explaining Postmodernism, and it's by a gentleman named Stephen Hicks.
Now, Explaining Postmodernism wouldn't be my first choice of books to read if you want to understand why conservatives like Peterson were so worried about postmodernism in the mid-2010s.
My pick would probably be Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay's Cynical Theories. Not necessarily because it's a better book, neither are particularly great, but published in 2020, Cynical Theories just better captures the energy of the postmodern panic at its height.
Take this quote from the intro.
Postmodernism has, depending upon your view, either become or given rise to one of the least tolerant and most authoritarian ideologies that the world has had to deal with since the widespread decline of communism.
To all these thinkers then, postmodernism was clearly scary stuff. But if we want to understand a motive for why they might have killed it, we first need to understand our victim.
Let's roll another tape.
I compare postmodernism to the 9/11 hijackers who flew planes onto buildings. I argue that postmodernists fly buildings of bullshit into our edifices of reason.
This is Gad Saad, a Canadian professor of marketing with a special interest in evolutionary psychology, who, alongside Jordan Peterson, was a central figure in the postmodern panic of the mid-2010s. He's a staple of the Manosphere podcast circuit who really wants you to know that he's been cancelled.
So apparently a food restaurateur here in Ottawa caused me some food poisoning, so even the restaurateurs are trying to stifle my freedom of speech.
As he ever so sensitively put it in that first clip, the version of postmodernism which colonised the conservative mind at this time was, simply put, an ideology.
Or perhaps more accurately, it was an umbrella of ideologies, all of which, they argue, share a basic belief in the idea that objective truth doesn't exist. Instead, everything we're taught about the world and our place within it is constructed as a means of suppressing some groups and elevating others.
It basically posits that there are no objective truths. Everything is constrained by subjectivity, by the personal biases of whomever is doing the exploration.
Or, as James Lindsay puts it,
their claim is that power decides who gets to claim what it is and is not true. That if you have a claim upon the truth, a statement that you're saying may be true, it might actually be true or false, but that misses the point, because the point is that you have to interrogate the power dynamics that allowed somebody to have the authority to make that claim.
Contemporary feminism, anti-racism, LGBTQ+ advocacy, and disability rights activism, all, as these guys see it, sit firmly under that umbrella.
And they will usually claim that it is specifically the contemporary, supposedly postmodern versions of these movements which they're against.
They co-opted the civil rights movement. The good name of the civil rights movement is kind of the brand that they ride on. They're fighting against racism, they're fighting against sexism, misogyny, etc. And the thing is that's not really what's going on here. They've actually tapped into this, to throw around the term, this postmodern notion that everything in society has to do with power dynamics. And the power dynamics have to be understood in terms of groups, and how those groups have traditionally held power and exercised power.
See, older forms of what's sometimes called identity politics generally fought for the rights of marginalised groups in a manner which accepted the social categories which underpinned that oppression.
First and second wave feminism generally fought for the rights of women as women.
Mid-century anti-racism broadly fought for the rights of black people, for example, as black people. Over more recent decades, however, some within those movements have questioned the very validity of those categories themselves.
In the 80s, mostly getting toward the late 80s, you started to have these discussions from a variety of different people. Mary Poovey within feminism, for example, Bell Hooks and Kimberly Crenshaw within the kind of black feminism going into critical race theory analysis. And what they were saying is that postmodern tools are very useful for breaking down to just deconstruct, in fact, the fundamentals of systemic power.
More modern versions of these movements have drawn upon the postmodern notion that objective truth is, at best, difficult to ascertain, to argue that the categories of race or gender upon which these identities rest are flawed human creations.
Yes, human beings may have an array of different skin colours and different reproductive organs, but the idea that we should draw hard lines between groups of people based on these differences is, they would argue, a human invention. Gender, race, sexuality, disability, these things are, as the saying goes, social constructs.
The idea that any of these anti-postmodernism warriors would have been dyed-in-the-wool feminists 40 years ago seems, at best, questionable.
I could be fully liberal and supportive of transgender rights while also saying, look, if you're 270 pounds and 6'4" and suddenly you call yourself a woman, no, you can't compete against biological women.
This is an unconventional warfare. This is what they do in unconventional warfare. They make these provocations. Drag queens are a provocation. It's been an escalating provocation.
My suspicions are that a fair number of these feminists who are pushing the freedom idea, when freedom is the same as licentiousness, are naive, immature, and somewhat dark triad or tetrad-oriented women, psychopathic, cluster B, borderline, etc., who are looking to justify their refusal to grow up and accept responsibility by clothing it in ideological guise.
Some truly well-meaning, nuanced critiques there.
Nevertheless, to take them at their word for a minute, their opposition to postmodernism was partly based on the idea that overly critiquing the truthfulness of race and gender categories, for example, was kind of unnecessary and confusing.
It was to throw the meaningful baby out with the racist bathwater.
Well, radical feminism is another perfect manifestation of this, right? In the pursuit of equality under the law, which we should all support, that doesn't mean that we reject that there are innate sex differences. But most radical feminists think that by giving leeway to the possibility that men and women might be different, this opens the door to maintaining the sexist patriarchal status quo.
As Peterson and Saad's obsession with free speech and being cancelled shows, these anti-postmodernism campaigners also fretted about the extent to which this postmodern turn supposedly shifted concern away from discriminatory laws, policies and practices, and instead towards matters of language and cultural representation. After all, if gender is merely a social construct, then achieving gender equality involves trying to shift the ways in which we let gendered stereotypes inflect our culture.
In combating this, the various movements which conservatives placed under the postmodern umbrella had some success.
We had a black Hermione Granger, a woman Doctor Who, a lesbian in a video game. Employers began putting on diversity training, and women began talking more openly about experiences of abuse in the workplace, which also seemed to get tied up in the anti-postmodernist backlash too.
It's very easy for people to come forward with accusations and demolish someone's reputation. That's trial by public opinion. We don't have any conversation about the other side of the coin. You don't think women manipulate men sexually for advancement in the workplace?
Perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised that conservatives would have such a response.
The writer Rubin argues that the binding thread of conservatism since the 18th century has been the felt experience of having power, seeing it threatened, and trying to win it back. Through a certain lens, the increased inclusion of non-male, non-white, non-straight, and non-able-bodied people can easily look like an attack on straight white, able-bodied men. Maybe this wasn't an attempt to right ongoing wrongs, but to seize cultural power.
In fact, maybe it was best to not think of all this postmodern stuff as something new, but as Marxism reborn.
Both Hicks's book and Pluckrose and Lindsay's book spend much of their time weaving a narrative in which the failure of left-wing European academics to inspire their compatriots to revolution during the early and mid-20th centuries caused them to shift gears to promote this perceived postmodern umbrella of ideologies instead.
And they almost got away with it. Almost.
Over the past 6 months, these various identity-based political movements have taken a little bit of a beating. Under their more recently given label of wokeness, newspapers across the political spectrum have used the continuing victories of the populist right in America and Europe to call its time of death.
So, can Jordan Peterson and his anti-postmodern pals claim that scalp? Do we lock them up, throw away the key, and end the video here? Well, no.
The problem is that the particular definition of postmodernism which fueled this conservative panic was, at best, based on a pretty faulty understanding of what postmodernism actually was. This grand story of intellectual renegades looking to corrupt Western civilization might be compelling, but postmodernism as it actually existed was a far broader trend. In fact, far from being a narrowly left-wing phenomenon, it fundamentally rewired conservative politics too.
In order to really understand what killed postmodernism then, we first need to reframe exactly what it was in the first place. Suspect number 2. Donald Trump and Elon Musk with a little bit of fascism in the White House. Let's re-roll that Elon Musk video.
And I just want to say thank you for making it happen. Thank you.
You're gonna see this clip a lot in this video.
If you wanted a sign that postmodernism as defined by Jordan Peterson and co was dead, then the President of the United States' right-hand man popping a Hitler salute at the official inauguration party is pretty crystal clear.
The far right were no longer in the ascendant, but had now twice captured the most powerful seat in global politics, and were becoming increasingly bold in their political statements.
But I think it's also the sign of something deeper.
See, Elon Musk's Hitler salute, and those of the other Trump supporters which followed it, sent shockwaves around the world. And that shock was first and foremost because it was a Hitler salute. It's a gesture which represents the deepest of trauma, suffering and evil.
And yet, for many onlookers, this sense of shock also existed alongside another emotion. Cringe.
Musk is no stranger to cringe.
I am become meme. Yeah, pretty much.
This is, after all, a 53-year-old man who is obsessed with the Doge meme.
Well, now the Doge father.
Okay, Doge father. So.
But the more he's brought his cringy ways into the political sphere, the more revealing it's become for how our politics is changing. Because that sense of cringe you might have felt watching Musk's arm explode out towards the crowd probably didn't only come from the belief that being a Nazi specifically is cringe.
Until very, very recently, the idea of believing in any political ideology enough that you would start using its lingo and aping its signature gestures was widely considered deeply lame.
In most environments, you'd have got much the same response for doing a fist and calling people comrade. Isms, whether fascism, communism, anarchism, or whatever else, were broadly thought of as artifacts of a less sophisticated past.
And that widespread sense of skepticism towards any ideological explanation for what's wrong with the world and how to fix it had a name: postmodernism.
Far from simply being a small umbrella of ideologies, postmodernism was a way of thinking about the world which permeated every aspect of our politics and culture.
But the best way to understand quite what it was, and whether Trump and Musk might have killed it, is to understand how this version of postmodernism came into existence in the first place. Let's start with another video.
20 years ago, 25 years ago, I couldn't speak, really, I couldn't speak when a tape recorder was on the table. And now, I don't even notice it.
This is Jacques Derrida. To folks like James Lindsay and Jordan Peterson, Derrida is, along with Michel Foucault, one of the two horsemen of the postmodern apocalypse.
Genuinely, they hate these guys.
That's Michel Foucault in the middle, and a more reprehensible individual you could hardly ever discover or even dream up, no matter how twisted your imagination. Foucault and Derrida, I would say, there's more, but I would say they're the two architects of the postmodernist movement.
But I don't want to talk about Derrida today. I want to talk about the guy that he's speaking with.
This is Raymond Williams. Raymond Williams was a British literary critic and media theorist who was interested in the relationship between culture, power, and social change. He spent his career asking how the prevailing power dynamics of an era worked to shape the books, plays, films, and music produced during that era, and, in turn, how those books, plays, films, and music end up contributing to shifts in the use and distribution of power.
One of Williams's most influential ideas was what he called structures of feeling.
He used this phrase to describe the way in which, in any given historical moment, the way that most people examine, analyse, and intellectually respond to the world around them tends to share certain attributes, shaped by the various social and economic changes taking place during that moment.
To say that a historical era had a structure of feeling is not to say that everyone who lived within that era thought the same things.
People have always disagreed with one another about politics, science, culture, religion, and pretty much everything else. But in the way they arrive at and express those conflicting beliefs, we can often find more than a few commonalities.
Take, for example, the structure of feeling which came to shape a lot of the politics, art, and a great deal else during the late 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, and which came to be known as modernism.
Modernism.
Let me show you this book, 100 Artists' Manifestos.
It's a collection of artistic statements of intent written by various painters, sculptors, performance artists, and others between 1909 and 2009. Each of these manifestos, in its own way, outlines a different vision of what good art should look like. Is the best form of art futurism, or Dadaism, or Stuckism?
Many of the artists whose manifestos are contained within this book are diametrically opposed in their answer to that question. And yet, beneath those disagreements is what we might call, following Raymond Williams, a shared structure of feeling.
See, many of these artists clearly view their role as being to try to create the best style of art possible. All of them have taken their individual preferences for what makes good art and have given that set of preferences a name. In writing a manifesto, they've converted that style into a movement, which seeks to encourage others to adopt that style and abandon all others.
These artists might disagree on the specifics of what makes for good art then, but there was clearly something in the air which led them all to believe that through reason and argumentation, we might arrive at some final, perfect art form.
This shared, modernist structure of feeling within the art world is interesting enough. But what makes it even more so is that if we expand our lens a bit, we see similar tendencies in other arenas too. Just 8 years after the publication of the first manifesto contained in this book, revolutionaries in Russia began establishing a socialist state inspired by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' Communist Manifesto. The same artist who wrote the Futurist Manifesto in this book would later write a manifesto for Benito Mussolini's Italian fascists. Liberals, too, spent much of the late 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries writing documents which claimed to outline the best way to organise society, from the US Declaration of Independence to the UN Declaration of Human Rights.
As with the artists included in this book, the authors of those political tracts clearly disagreed greatly in the specifics of their politics. And yet, the modernist structure of feeling which shaped how they arrived at those beliefs clearly shared a great deal.
This was, after all, an era of mass urbanization, industrialization, globalization. And with human ingenuity leading to so much technological progress, there was an underlying sense that perhaps the same could be achieved in relation to how we organize society politically. Many true believers gave their preferred political models names: communism, fascism, liberalism, anarchism. And whether through debate or force, they saw their goal as being to implement those ideologies and to eradicate all others.
A key point of Raymond Williams's, however, was that these structures of feeling shift and change over time.
Viewed from the present day, all these manifestos seem, at best, a little naive in their rigid commitment to a certain way of making art or organising the world. If a friend told you they'd written a manifesto explaining how to create what they thought was objectively the best form of art, you'd probably find that a little bit cringe. If they told you they'd written an all-encompassing political manifesto, you'd probably be more than a bit worried.
And that's because at some point during the 20th century, the boldness and sense of social progress which runs throughout these manifestos was shaken somewhat. and supplanted by a new structure of feeling, which came to be known, fittingly, as postmodernism. And it took hold, at least in part, because of dudes doing stuff like this. Let me show you another video.
This is footage of Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, taken on its liberation in 1945. At first, images of Auschwitz and other such camps were held back from public circulation in order to avoid causing panic amongst Europeans with missing relatives. But the Allied leadership soon reversed that decision in favour of making plain the true extent of the Nazis' genocide of Jews, Roma people, Slavs, LGBTQ people, and others it deemed alien to its worldview.
Much of the early to mid-20th century was a montage of man-made atrocities. Genocides, famines, massacres, nuclear bombs.
Individual acts of barbarism might have turned people against individual ideologies, but the seeming predictability with which any of these all-encompassing programs for how to fix the world ended in some form of either mass surveillance or mass slaughter ended up killing off any widespread belief in ideological ways of thinking.
This shift did get some acknowledgement in the narrative of the anti-postmodern panic.
The postmodernists figured out that we looked at the world through a story, but they said their mantra is they became skeptical of meta-narratives, which are uniting narratives.
When Jordan Peterson or James Lindsay or Gad Saad complain that the postmodernists they hate so much don't believe in objective truth, this is broadly what they're picking up on. The modernist ideologies of the 19th and 20th centuries all claimed to provide their followers with an objectively true political theory of everything. The structure of feeling which underlay the postmodern era, however, was one of deep skepticism towards such things.
In fact, Jordan Peterson himself is a vocal critic of clinging too tightly to political ideology.
Where the postmodern panickers went wrong then was to frame this skepticism towards totalizing explanations of the world as some nefarious invention of devious academics who then attempted to spread that skepticism onto others. The reality was a much more widespread, organic shift in structure of feeling.
It is true that some intellectuals decided to embrace this shift, and to see what doing so might tell us about how the world works.
Michel Foucault, for example, argued that what he called the discourse around many social topics often wasn't an objectively true description of how things were in the world, but worked to support certain power relations.
In this book, for example, he questions what were then seen as absolute truths about homosexuality, asking why society had elevated the fairly simple matter of who one sleeps with into a whole identity category.
And he argued that this often had helped to marginalise and pathologise anyone who engages in gay sex.
Homosexuality appeared as one of the forms of sexuality when it was transposed from the practice of sodomy onto a kind of interior androgyny. The sodomite had been a temporary aberration. The homosexual was now a species.
Many feminists, including Judith Butler of Gender Trouble fame, asked similar questions about gender. Nevertheless, without wanting to diminish the work of Foucault, Butler, or any other broadly postmodern writer, the idea that a small coterie of often tough-to-read philosophers could reshape the way the world thinks in such a deep way is a bit of a stretch.
It requires a belief in the impact of lengthy philosophy books, which can only be shared by people who also write lengthy philosophy books.
That sense of skepticism about purported objective truths was clearly embedded in every aspect of society. As the second half of the 20th century proceeded, trust in all kinds of authority shattered. The media, politicians, scientists, economists, doctors, journalists, figures who once would have at least carried some respect and consideration began to be viewed with deep suspicion. People of all political stripes began to question the absolute truths such experts claimed to offer.
I think the people in this country have had enough of experts with organisations from acronyms.
The people of this country have had enough of experts.
From organisations with.
In fact, as that Jordan Peterson clip showed, the extreme scepticism of this postmodern structure of feeling reshaped conservative politics just as much as it ever shaped so-called identity politics. There's an interesting moment in an interview with James Lindsay where he's forced to face up to this realisation.
Now, every claim seems inordinately strong, but some important claims resting on power dynamics seems like a hypothesis worth entertaining.
I agree. In fact, I point out that if we look, I mentioned Fauci quite intentionally. If we look at how the COVID-19 policy, there's much skepticism, at least on the right, around it. If you look at this situation, the way, Fauci said, don't wear a mask. Then he said, wear a mask. Then he said, wear 2 masks. Then he said the CDC maybe doesn't know if you should wear 2 masks. Then he said, nope, probably 2 masks. Maybe we have to do 3 masks. You get into anything fuzzier than the very hard sciences, that you do have this kind of human element that has to be investigated and interrogated.
The anti-POMO crowd hated it when their political opponents questioned certain supposed absolute truths and their relation to power. But many were, and continue to be, obsessed with doing so.
In fact, Foucault's interest in the relationship between language and power found a pretty clear mirror in the increasing conservative obsession with free speech.
Whether it was complaints about political correctness in the 1990s, cancel culture in the 2010s, or social media moderation in more recent years, conservatives often seemed more interested in arguing about how we argue than about the pros and cons of any specific policy. They became hyperfixated on meta-debate about how conservative voices were supposedly being sidelined or silenced, or how we were being lied to by schools, universities, the media, science, big tech, and others. Like all good inhabitants of the postmodern epoch, they argued that the objective truths we hear about the world around us are shaped by who is allowed to speak and how.
How many Democrats are worried about cancel culture? 23%. Why? Because they know they're not the ones who are going to get canceled. Okay, you cannot have a country when half the country believes that the other half of the country is inherently evil.
In fact, one of the most powerful trends of this postmodern era was the way in which a skepticism towards ideology, combined with an obsession with language and discourse, could often combine to obfuscate any meaningful conversations about how we want to live together in the world.
This was something explored at length by this guy, Jean Baudrillard. Baudrillard argued that the postmodern era was one of hyper-reality. All this distrust, along with the increasing power of the media, had led to a scenario in which how an event or person was represented on TV or in the newspapers was often infinitely more important than the event or person themselves.
This was particularly evident in the corridors of power.
In a decisive rejection of the tub-thumping, manifesto-writing approach to politics taken in the previous century, Bill Clinton and Tony Blair claimed to be following a third way between left-wing and right-wing politics.
They did, of course, continue to pass laws which massively affected people's lives. As they did, however, they shrank from the idea that they were following any meaningful worldview.
This was the era of the West Wing and the thick of it and Veep, in which being a good politician was no longer about conveying a meaningful vision to your country and winning people over to that vision, but about wearing the right clothes and having the right body language.
Put on a proper suit, do up your tie, and sing the national anthem!
Which brings us back to this.
Thank you.
During the sheer absurdity of the first Trump campaign and presidency, many slightly nerdier commentators reached for the terminology of postmodernism to explain what was going on. This was, after all, a president who was prepared to question even the most concretely established truths: climate science, medical research, and eventually election results.
There are books that are written on how the election was rigged.
Everything and anything was on the table if he didn't like it.
There was also more than a degree of hyperreality to the manner in which Trump set himself up as a campaigner against the elite, despite himself being a multi-billionaire businessman.
That even this status as a successful multi-billionaire businessman was partly constructed through his playing a successful multi-billionaire businessman on reality TV meant it was easy to view his insurgent candidacy as postmodernism amplified to absurdity. Reality and truth meant nothing anymore. No one really believed in anything, and appearances had fully trumped substance.
They say, I have the most loyal people. Did you ever see that? Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay? It's like incredible.
And yet, while there is so much of Trump, his campaigns, and his presidencies which have channeled some of these postmodern tendencies, there also clearly is a substance to MAGA politics, increasingly so over time.
And this has often been a key part of his appeal.
In each of the 3 elections that Donald Trump has stood in, it's not only been that the 2 candidates' policy platforms have felt worlds apart. Their fundamental conceptions of what politics is were in different universes. On the one hand were a set of competent managers, 2 of whom might have shaken things up a touch by being the first woman president, but whose pitches didn't extend much beyond a vague promise of competency.
Biden spoke at a private fundraiser earlier this week and told the big donors that he didn't want to demonize the wealthy, and added that under his presidency, no one's standard of living will change. Nothing will fundamentally change.
On the other hand, was someone who was willing to completely reimagine what America and the world could be, who was unafraid of doing big things.
All illegal entry will immediately be halted, and we will begin the process of returning millions and millions of criminal aliens back to the places from which they came.
There are many aspects of Donald Trump's campaigns and presidencies which have been deeply postmodern. And yet, also in there is an emotive political sincerity of precisely the kinds that postmodernism rejected.
It might not be a politics you agree with, the exact shape of it might regularly chop and change, but amid all the silliness, Trump supporters believe in him and in MAGA with an earnestness which many assumed to be a thing of the modernist past. Even those who chose to believe that this wasn't a Hitler salute still connect to the passion with which it was delivered.
So, have we found our killer? Did Donald Trump murder postmodernism through reintroducing people to the idea that another world is possible? Well, we're certainly getting closer.
Both Trump and Musk's political careers do represent a clear break from the postmodernism which dominated much of the late 20th and early 21st century.
But once again, we have to ask whether they truly caused this break, or whether the emergence of this new structure of feeling might be a much broader phenomenon.
Suspect number 3. The 2008 financial crisis with widespread instability in the global economy. Let me show you another video.
Because something has shifted since, I would say, the late 90s, early 2000s. Something fundamental. Something that everyone has noticed, but that people have found very hard to put their finger on.
This is Timotheus Vermeulen, Professor of Media, Culture and Society at the University of Oslo. In 2010, Vermeulen and a colleague, Robin van der Akker, published an article titled Notes on Meta-modernism. It was far from the first academic publication to suggest that postmodernism might be dead or dying, but it was one of the first to offer a really compelling explanation of what might have replaced it. Vermeulen and Akker argued that the deeply cynical, sceptical way of viewing the world which defined postmodernism had been shaken by a series of crises. They named the 2008 financial crisis and the climate crisis in particular, but we might add on the global housing crisis, aging populations, rising inequality, and the collapse of the international institutions which were supposed to fend off both trade wars and real ones to that list. Perhaps it was possible to roll our eyes at truth and ideology during eras of far-off wars and economic bubbles, but a world as crisis-stricken as ours seems to demand actual positive action. It seems to demand a plan.
it kind of demands some ideology.
Vermeulen and Acker primarily focused their thoughts on art, but in ways which lead to interesting revelations about politics too. See, postmodern art, often intentionally or otherwise, invited audiences to question our socially constructed objective truths about what does and doesn't count as art, what is and isn't real. Thus, Roy Lichtenstein elevates comic book panels to the status of art through placing them on canvases. Jeff Koons places the childish motif of the balloon dog in the role of a statue. In film and TV, we saw the embrace of both reality TV and mockumentary, genres which, in their own ways, dance on the border between truth and fiction.
Carry it, bear with me. Right?
What? They're filming.
That's the film crew.
Oh.
I told you about this, the film crew. Martin?
Hi, Mark.
This is Janine.
Part of the argument that postmodernism is dead rests on the simple idea that such devices and genres have kind of just run their course.
Koons or Lichtenstein's suggestion that anything can be art if you kind of think about it might be a genuine revelation at first, but once you get it, you've kind of got it. And the same can be said for the idea that all ideologies can be bad if you accept them uncritically. In fact, it's notable that postmodern art always felt far better at offering cynical jabs at the world around it than illustrating how the world could be better.
Take Borat.
The first Borat film utilizes a number of postmodern devices in order to poke fun at the one-dimensional view that many Americans had, and still have, about the world beyond their borders. But it has no interest in rectifying that problem. It largely just perpetuated it. Dudes who wear Borat costumes or mankinis on stag weekends aren't doing so as a nuanced parody of American chauvinism, they just think it's funny when the Kazakh guy says, "My wife."
My wife! Borat! Do it again. Jeff, get in here. You gotta hear this. My wife! Yes.
This inability of postmodernism to actually solve anything is mirrored in the political sphere.
The drive to reject anything which looks too much like ideology has been at the root of inaction on many of the largest crises facing us today. But a political field which is obsessed with finding some perceived centre ground is one which is biased towards inaction. Our living standards, our environment, our economies, our social fabric have all been just allowed to collapse by a politics which has been scared to do anything more than tinker around the edges for fear of being deemed too ideological. Vermeulen and Acker suggests that in a world of crisis, we've begun to look for more than just wit and cynicism. But crucially, they argued that we can't simply roll back the clock to a more sincere, modernist structure of feeling. It's simply not possible for us to go back to that kind of naive sincerity. We're all too brain-fried for that now.
They thus argue that postmodernism has given way to a new structure of feeling which they call meta-modernism.
Meta-modernism, they write,
oscillates between the modern and the postmodern. It oscillates between a modern enthusiasm and a postmodern irony, between hope and melancholy, between naivete and knowingness, empathy and apathy, unity and plurality, totality and fragmentation, purity and ambiguity.
In film, they point to the work of Wes Anderson, which on the one hand is extremely silly. Anderson's films are often pastiches of particular genres or time periods. The detached performance styles and Anderson's exquisite framing of shots means we're rarely encouraged to fully suspend our disbelief and lose ourselves in the truth the film is weaving for us. And yet, neither are Anderson's films entirely cynical. They're often deeply touching. As a result, they're neither entirely modern nor postmodern. They're both and neither.
There's 3 grabbers, 3 taggers, 5 twig runners, and the player at whack-bat. The center tagger lights a pine cone, chucks it over the basket, and the whack-batter tries to hit the cedar stick off the cross rock. Then the twig runners dash back and forth until the pine cone burns out and the umpire calls hot box.
Metamodernism then is a structure of feeling in which we seem to want to believe in stuff again. In art or film, that thing might be love or beauty or happy endings. In politics, it might be solidarity or the might and superiority of one's nation or race.
Nevertheless, we still have to contend with an awkwardness about doing so, partly driven by a recognition that too rigid a belief in any of these things will be riven with holes, and also a fear that being too sincere remains just kind of lame.
We find ourselves swinging back and forth between those two poles. We know that belief in anything is a flawed concept, and yet in spite of that knowledge, we do so anyway. Which brings us back, once again, to this.
My heart goes out to you.
See, Elon Musk's Hitler salute at the 2025 inaugural parade was shocking. But it wasn't the first time that a Donald Trump victory had been celebrated with such a gesture.
Weeks after Trump was first elected in 2016, supporters of the white supremacist think tank, the National Policy Institute, gathered for a conference in Washington, D.C., at which supporters applauded a speech by the organization's president, Richard Spencer, like this.
Hail Trump! Hail our people! Hail victory!
When asked about the enthusiastic Hitler salutes which his speech had inspired by PBS producer PJ Tobiah, Spencer claims that the salutes were clearly done in a spirit of irony and exuberance. This was a well-practiced defense on the part of what was then often called the alt-right. Inspired, at least in part, by the quote-unquote edgy humour of online spaces like 4chan, the use of fascist iconography and offensive slurs, when criticised, was often brushed off as mere irony.
Their somewhat spurious defence was that we should view members of the alt-right doing Hitler salutes in much the same vein as we might view Sacha Baron Cohen's ludicrous stereotype of a Kazakh guy.
Yes, the salutes themselves might be deeply offensive, but they're actually being done to provoke a reaction, to expose how sensitive contemporary liberal society is. After all, of course the guys throwing up those salutes weren't real Nazis. Who would be naive, foolish, modern enough to be an actual Nazi in the 21st century?
In the immediate aftermath of Elon Musk's Hitler salute, many quite understandably sought to proactively counter this kind of apologia.
Lenz Jakobsen wrote an article for the German newspaper Die Zeit headlined, "A Hitler salute is a Hitler salute is a Hitler salute." Yet, in the article, he also noted that whatever desire Elon Musk may have had to perform a Hitler salute specifically was obviously paired with a more cynical desire to court controversy and attention.
Musk's salute then wasn't the sign of a simple return to a mid-century, po-faced modernist Nazism.
Trumpism is fascism reinvented for a meta-modern era, constantly swinging back and forth between mimetic irony and genuine belief in a far-right ideological conception of the world.
Trump gods are shining bright, golden future, a brand new life. Feast and dance, the deal is done. Trump gods are number one.
The whole MAGA movement thrives on an interplay between detached cynicism and a genuine heartfelt belief in Trump's nativist libertarian policy agenda.
This is a political movement which is a vector for both the ridiculousness of the Trump coin, but also the raw brutality of extrajudicial imprisonment and deportation. It sometimes gets obsessed with deeply postmodern, language-focused debates over, for example, the naming of the Gulf of Mexico, but will then also go and throw up tariffs and cut SNAP payments.
At least part of the success of the contemporary populist right lies in their ability to channel this meta-modern structure of feeling at a time when many establishment liberal parties seem deeply stuck in the past.
It's not only that their specific technocratic policies seem incommensurate with the challenges facing us today, but that their entire mode of doing politics feels awkward and out of step with how most of us are engaging with the world.
And yet, Trumpism certainly isn't unique in its ability to cohere with this emerging meta-modern era.
Political movements on the left have regularly channeled this structure of feeling too. Bernie Sanders' 2 runs for the Democratic presidential nomination and Jeremy Corbyn's tenure as leader of the Labour Party in the UK were both motivated by a desire to return to a politics which was ambitious enough to believe that real, widespread change is possible.
As does MAGA, these movements often sought to invoke the memories of earlier, modernist versions of their respective political leanings.
The team which designed Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's posters intentionally drew inspiration from the colour palettes of posters made for mid-century Labour Labor leader Cesar Chavez, and with their strong single-colour fonts, evoked old-school letterpress printing far more than the Adobe Creative Cloud. The UK Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn fought the 2017 general election on the slogan, "For the many, not the few," a reference to a poem by Percy Shelley about a pro-democracy demonstration which was violently suppressed in 1819.
Ye are many, they are few.
But again, like MAGA, these were not simple, uncritical returns to a modernist socialism. They were often steeped in the low-level silliness of meme culture.
As the FEC fundraising deadline for 2019 approaches, I am once again asking for your financial support.
In fact, this meta-modern approach to politics hasn't been confined to electoral campaigns. Many of the identity-based movements which the postmodern panickers explicitly set themselves up against, Black Lives Matter for instance, leaned far more into the meta-modern than the postmodern.
There were certainly aspects of these movements which had a primarily postmodern interest in how language and representations uphold certain power dynamics. When protesters in Bristol tore down a long-despised statue of slaver Edward Colston, for example, they did so precisely because they argued that having a statue celebrating a slaver in the city centre helped to uphold a white supremacist view of the world. Nevertheless, much of the political content of Black Lives Matter was explicitly about pushing beyond these conversations about language to highlight the very material ways in which black people continue to be treated less favourably. A particular focus being discriminatory policing, which is perhaps the most visceral political concern that you can imagine.
As you well know by now, all of these broadly left-wing meta-modern political movements have since been wiped from the political map.
The socialist revival of the 2010s was outmaneuvered by a liberal establishment which saw sabotaging a resurgent left optimism as far more important than offering a genuinely compelling narrative of its own. That same liberal establishment quickly jettisoned support for social justice movements as soon as it felt they had become a political hindrance.
All of which lands us in a pretty strange spot.
In a previous era, this video of Elon Musk hurling a Hitler salute would have been political suicide. In 2025, it's the mark of someone who has a deep understanding of our shared structure of feeling. In a video I made nearly 5 years ago now, I argued that a key part of Elon Musk's appeal as a real-life Tony Stark, as he was then seen, was that the technologies he sells offered an enticing vision of the future in an era which had largely forgotten how to dream of such things. That appeal is a key part of his newfound popularity on the right. But what I perhaps overlooked in that previous video was that it's not only about being able to visualize a different future on a practical level, but about a desire for a politics which makes us feel again.
For better, or probably for worse, Musk and Trump's politics is a highly emotive one. It has heroes and villains. It speaks to greatness, and not only power, but empowerment.
It channels a meta-modern structure of feeling which constantly swings like a pendulum back and forth between ludicrous displays of hyperreal, attention-grabbing nonsense and a terrifyingly sincere politics. Establishment liberalism, whether in the form of the Democrat Party in the US, the Labour Party in the UK, or many of the ailing centre-right and centre-left parties in Europe, doesn't presently seem to be able to do either of those things all that convincingly. They continue to operate within an increasingly outdated structure of feeling where wearing the right suit, saying the right thing at a press conference, and avoiding accusations of being too ideological are enough to carry the day.
But postmodernism is dead. Liberal inaction on the many crises facing our world is part of what killed it. Mounting a meaningful answer to Trumpism requires first acknowledging that, and then building an alternative politics which can speak to the meta-modern structure of feeling which we find ourselves living in now. And if you want to join a very serious political movement, I'm sure you'll be able to find one in Abolish Everything. the new comedy panel show brought to you by the team behind Jetlag the Game and available to watch exclusively on Nebula. Each episode of Abolish Everything features 4 comedians using every ounce of their rhetorical skills to rouse a live studio audience into abolishing some aspect of modern life which really grinds their gears, all the while opposed by the political establishment, who will try to shoot their arguments down. The first season of Abolish Everything features some great special guests, including Kyle Gordon, Annie Rauwerda from Depths of Wikipedia, and Dan Toomey from Good Work, and it's been so popular it's already been recommissioned for a second season. Abolish Everything is available to watch exclusively on Nebula, where it joins a growing catalogue of great creator-made films and shows, including my debut feature-length documentary and now Webby Awards honoree, Boomers, which, if you haven't seen it yet, now is a fantastic time to join me on a road trip through the US and Europe to uncover the lives and legacy of the baby boomer generation. If you want to watch Abolish Everything, Boomers, and a whole load of other great shows and films from your favourite indie creators, then you can support the channel by signing up to Nebula using my link go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas. That link will also get you a 40% discount on an annual Nebula subscription, meaning you can stream all of that video goodness for just $3 per month. It's got no ads, no uplift for 4K, no sneakiness. In fact, if you don't want to add another subscription to your monthly budget, you can even opt for our lifetime plan, which has proven really popular. This is obviously more expensive up front, but gets you access to Nebula for as long as both you and the platform exist, whilst helping us build the amount of money that we've got available for commissioning even more great shows. That link again is go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas. Enjoy Abolish Everything and Boomers, and I'll see you over on Nebula. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you've enjoyed it. All that's left for me to do is to say a massive thank you to my top tier supporters over on Patreon, who are Richard, Gary, Dick on Spain, Bill Mitchell, ZC Reese, Zoe Alden, Alexander Blank, Neil to Buildguard, Sophia R, Sergio Suarez, Richard Rapoon, Amit Singh Parahar, Gabriel Koch, Jimmy Dunn, Fiasco Linguini, Agent Maxwell, Glenn Sugden, Jarabar, Yillamson, and Paulius Edicus. If you want to join them in getting copies of the scripts to these videos, early glimpses at stuff we're working on, and access to my weekly blog, The Friday Update, then you can do so over at patreon.com/Tom Nicholas. Other than that, thanks so much for watching once again, and have a great week.